and you're assessing the threats, and then you're able to come up with mitigation strategies, physical delay barriers, weapon systems and responses based on what those threats are.
All right, well, we're here on episode 30 of Complacency Kills, a Kontek podcast, and today we got Pete Peterson over here. You guys are, I'm sure, familiar with him, and he's kind of our in-house specialist actually for kind of the topic we're gonna go back and forth about, which is really just doing initial threat and vulnerability assessments, security assessments for a variety of different industries and what that kind of looks like and what are some of the pitfalls that people fall into. But anyway, so let's go ahead and kick it off, man. So can you share your background as it relates to security assessments in general?
Yep, U.S. military. I was 20 plus years, United States Marine Corps. During that time, I was able to participate and be a part of MARSOC. I was a Marine Raider for 14 of those years. Great experience. And during that time, huge part of the job for some of the teams, both on the intelligence side and the kinetic side, is threat vulnerability assessment, not just for physical facilities, but just in general, right? The threat environment that you're operating in. And so we did a lot of what is commonly referred to as a threat assessment or a threat vulnerability assessment. And really what it, boils down to and what it means is, you're looking at whatever physical structure you have or the environment or connected environments that you're operating in, and you're assessing the threats, and then you're able to come up with mitigation strategies, physical delay barriers, weapon systems and responses based on what those threats are. So it can be everything from just locking doors to a physical barrier, chain link fence, camera system, surveillance, and intrusion detection. So it has a wide berth of application across a variety of fields, both in the civilian sector as well as high consequence facilities, government facilities, Department of Defense, type facilities, military bases, both here and abroad.
Okay. So, when it comes to, a threat and vulnerability assessment or security assessment, obviously it can range from everything from your own residence to business, school, place of worship, all the way to an entire military base, right?
No.
So, with that being said, what would the process even look like? I'm going to throw a scenario out there for an elementary school, right? And they're looking for a third party to come and do an assessment. Can you give me a quick rundown of what that process would even look like?
So initially, right, you've got to just kind of decide on, what is the area that we're going into, right? You've identified it. You said, hey, we're going into a school setting. This is a civilian structure, right? So there's some constraints and restraints that you have to kind of initially identify. What is it, that you're actually trying to protect, and then what is it that you're trying to protect against? Inside of the threat vulnerability assessment process, you're kind of able to identify some of those key features, that will create threat mitigation strategies for you. And so by that, I mean, basically starting at, all right, we've got a building, does that building need a fence? From that, that right there, is there access control that you can implement, for this environment? There are templated strategies, they have Carver and a couple other that the military uses and that the civilian sector uses, that kind of go down the process in a very detailed way that gives you a number at the end of it or a scoring mechanism or a metric to kind of measure against.
Sure.
And I've seen it done that way. I've seen it done in reverse order, where we know what the threat is, or we want to be able to protect to this threshold. What are we worried about at a school? Potentially an active shooter. We want to deny access to people that don't belong to the school or don't have business at the school. So it's kind of twofold, right? The high-end extreme threat being, the potential active shooter, right? And on the lower end, just denying ability for the general public to, operate within the perimeter of that school, if that makes sense.
Right.
So,
okay.
And that's, I would say, a starting point, and different organizations use different policies and procedures to pursue that. But as a third-party consultant, you can start with kind of a templated security assessment where you're looking at it from the outside in, or you can start from threshold of threat back. Right?
Okay. So, I mean, in general, though, in this case, a school principal approaches you as wanting a third-party assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So does that look like you, doing an assessment from afar, like Google Maps or anything like that, kind of getting an idea of their existing security, plan or strategy in place? Yeah. And then would you be going on site afterwards to meet with them and actually walk down the facility?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. One of the first things you're going to do is, like I said, I talked about it a little bit, and it was a little long-winded, but the location, right? What is it? What is it we're trying to protect initially? Hey, it's a school, it's a building, all right? So now I know what that is. I would definitely want to converse with the staff, have an initial meeting or consultation and say, hey, what is it that you think is the biggest threat? What are you dealing with? What are the problems that you have? What do you think you're charged with protecting, right? My student body, the physical denial of access of this school to outsiders or people that don't belong and aren't badged, the active shooter threat. You get a variety of responses, and from that initial collection of information and being able to do some Google Maps imagery, or if they have imagery that they want to share with you of the external part of the facility, great. And if they're willing to share internal, that's well too. And you want maybe not a tech spec, but at least a layout of what the inside of that school is. And all of this at this point becomes protected information. You want to make sure you're safeguarding it. We're not here to, you don't want that information to be releasable. A lot of stuff, unfortunately, is on the internet right? I can Google a school and see what it looks like. I can also, through a variety of means, Facebook posts, social media, be able to find out what some of the inner workings of the school looks like if I was really targeting it, unfortunately, as we've seen in the past, with the active shooter threat increasing in school settings, being able to get that information. So I would be trying to collect as much information as I could before I requested a site visit, where I would actually conduct a walk down. And then
at the end of that, I assume you generate just a full report of your findings and recommendations?
Absolutely. I would probably use one of the templated security threat vulnerability matrices and measure that against both the statistics of what's happening criminally locally, what the threat mitigation policy and strategies they already have in place are, combined with what the threat threshold that they desire to be at. And I would be able to generate essentially an after-action report or a paper that specifically outlined, hey, these are the things that you guys are really doing well. These are the things that might cover down on the gap that you guys are trying to get to for the threat threshold you're trying to reach, right? And then I would offer some mitigation strategies and notes in that process. So you'd have a metriced approach with, significant notes and report writing afterwards to basically give them a full capture of where they're at, and again, external to internal, and then obviously actions they can take. And then sometimes it's as simple as card readers and access control, and you can start really denying certain things, and then from there physical delay, and then from there response capability and teacher actions or staff actions, and then from there locks and deadbolts and other types of equipment, delay features and lock features that deny anybody with criminal intent or that wishes to do harm, denying their ability to take action that way. So and those strategies would come from that report essentially.
Gotcha. So kind of what I'm curious about though is what's your opinion when it comes to, and I'm using this in this context of school and active shooter, TVA, and then the follow-on effects of it. What are your thoughts on how much do they share the response capability and measures in place with the student body?
So it's good that you mentioned that.
That's kind of an interesting piece.
When I go for the site visit, one of the first things that I would ask and what I would try to do is incorporate whatever security safety officer is on station. So whoever is responsible for security, whether that be staff, there's usually a designated teacher, principal, administrator that has the overall overarching responsibility for that. And I would also want whatever law enforcement or safety officer, if they had one, to be there, be present, and participate in it, as well as local law enforcement if I had the ability. So I would basically reach out and say, hey, you're going to be the responding police force that's most likely to enter this facility. What are the things that you guys assess? What are you doing? And I'm familiar with active shooter response and law enforcement and with special response teams and SWAT. And so I have, dealing with those officers and having done some of these TVAs for schools across the United States, I've had some interaction with them, and they are a very critical part of the planning process and should be incorporated, whether I'm doing it or whether some other third-party consulting firm. There's a lot of guys with a lot of education, both out of government services like the FBI and law enforcement, that have a wealth of experience that can help with these kinds of things, and bringing, someone like that in and including law enforcement and security staff, knowing what the response capabilities are, including everyone that's going to be a part of the process to deniability or meet the threat mitigation standards that you have set in place. Those are all the people that I want to sit at the table when we're doing the debrief on that report, if that makes sense.
Right. But what I'm getting at is kind of out of that report, right? Yeah. You've come up with a plan, you've generated a response action. I think Dave Chappelle actually has a joke on it where talking about, the teacher is essentially sharing the procedures of lockdown for active shooter, and you have the student in the back, taking all the notes. What kind of recommendation do you have? Because obviously you have to share with your student body, what you need to do as a student, but where do you create that gap of information to where there's other responses that and procedures that the students may not know about? Because obviously the insider threat or the active shooter, their big concern is they're already in the school and they already know their procedures. Any thoughts on that? What do you do?
Yeah, really, there's a certain amount of risk, living in a safe society and in a security environment. I would say to curb that or mitigate it to the best of your ability, I think what you can try and do is the actual response capability. I would not necessarily include, you know, the student body in, there'll be 14 officers showing up coming down this hallway if the threat is in the northeast wing. The actual emergency procedures, EPs, or the actual response procedures, they need to be known by the staff and shared amongst the staff. And there's some brevity codes that you can use over the communication system. Not that the students during these drills can't derive what that is, but I would say give them the amount of information they need to where you can direct traffic efficiently, and then the rest of it is safeguarded information that's for the staff, law enforcement, and everybody else. The reality is, if this student is going to the school and he's there for a long time, it's just like a fire drill. They have a rough idea of potentially what could happen, where police officers may make entry. But again, you know, they're not perfect, and you know, we're fortunate that criminals aren't always the smartest in their planning process. But I would say giving the amount of information that's required to complete the task, you know, for the process,
The bare minimum.
but not giving them anything more
Right.
that could potentially be used in a
Against
capacity, to mitigate, you know, your threat mitigation.
Right.
So it's kind of
it's a
I hate to
fine
say
line
it,
to
it
walk.
is, there is,
Yeah.
and that's why it takes the administrator, law enforcement, security safety officer. It's a lot of people working hard to have that strategy built after a TVA occurs or after a threat assessment occurs, to make sure that everything is where it needs to be, so you guys can have an effective response.
Yeah. So something else I want to talk about when it comes to security assessments in light of the recent assassination attempt. What kind of things have stood out to you? Obviously, we get a shit ton of information coming in the news. The credibility of all the information is always obviously difficult to decipher and kind of go through. But like, that is obviously a perfect use case of a prior security assessment potentially having gone wrong or lacked.
Yeah, you know, I don't think it's one of those things, you know, that's one, you know, smoking gun, this is what happened and this is what caused it. I think there was potentially a multitude of failures. I wasn't on the ground there. I don't know the security environment. I don't know the intelligence that they received. You know, we have a rough idea of what occurred in the timeline, and that's kind of based on what the media has released and what's been released to them. And so how much is accurate or inaccurate? I think over the years and coming months and years, we're going to have a more accurate picture of what occurred. You know, at the core of it, there was a security failure, right? That happened and it shouldn't have. There was a cordon, an outer cordon, an inner cordon. There was a security perimeter. There was an assessment done. I think there was initially, you know, looking at it, you know, from just a perspective of a guy who's done security and has the background I do. Yeah, there was some things that probably were not done, you know, I don't want to say by the book, but accurately or with the intention that they should have been.
Yeah.
And information during the execution phase. Planning, there may have been some failures. Execution, there may have been some failures. At the end of the day, shots were taken, threat was neutralized, and the objective, the principal, was taken off of the threat area and out and survived. Obviously, it could have had an entirely different outcome. So it's very easy to armchair quarterback or us to sit here and, you know, they did this wrong, they did that wrong. I don't know if there's enough information right now to really make that assessment, but I can tell you that, you know, anytime you see these types of events where there's a failure of security or a lapse in security at this level and this big, rarely is it a single, you know, failure or a single point of failure. There's usually a multitude of failures that lead to this collective, individual failures that lead to this collective end state, which is, you know, Trump had an effective assassination attempt, and the fact that there was shots fired when that threat could have been neutralized or identified and engaged prior to that happening. Again, I don't know the timeline. I'm not knocking the Secret Service agents or the security detail. I don't know all of the information to be able to make an educated, you know, assessment. I can tell you that, you know, just like any American, it's disheartening because you hope that things like that don't happen, right? But hope is not a plan, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to learn from this. We're going to find out there was some mistakes made. We're going to increase, you know, our threat level and threat awareness, specifically, you know, for former presidents and active, you know, and you know, follow the processes, protocols, and procedures that are set in place to have a successful security detail and security operation.
Yeah, and I think you kind of alluded to it. As you know, I'm kind of a weirdo for following aviation stuff and find it interesting, and I'm blanking on the name of the model, but essentially the Swiss cheese model, where most incidents, whether it's aviation or most incidents like this, when it's a security issue, it's a Swiss cheese model where it's not one event, it's not two, it's multiple layers of cheese, and the holes are, you know, those gaps that aren't filled, they happen to be located where your problem shoots, you know, eventually right through, right? But the system is designed to have multiple layers, right? So hopefully if it gets through one gap, there's still several other layers of cheese, right? To stop the issue. And it sounds like it could potentially have been one of those events where it was an accumulation of planning, prep, and then the actual execution pieces. So,
there's a lot I don't want to, you know, take away from. There's a lot of effort and energy that goes into security detail, protective services, Secret Service agents. There is a lot of effort and energy and training, and those officers are very capable. Again, it's a security environment, and no matter how well prepared you are, no matter how well planned, rehearsed, and executed you are, these types of things, as historically seen, do happen. What we need to take from this is the things that we did right, let's make sure we keep doing them. The things that we do right, let's do them better. And the things that we did not do so well, we've got to figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen in the future, or at least the same type of issues don't occur, allowing these types of threats to manifest into something more serious.
Right, and that's why it kind of goes, cyclical, whether it's an event like this, with the assassination attempt, or a school shooting, or even someone just breaking into a business, where it goes in this cycle of, after an event occurs, you're going to do an after action, a debrief, kind of go over what you just discussed.
Yeah.
But then you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and start with a fresh set of eyes, with that information, and do another TVA, do another security assessment.
That's a great point.
And it's kind of a revolving cycle that, always, the intent is to continue to improve.
Unfortunately, and I would say this is a lot of organizations, and as individuals, we're guilty of it too, we become more reactive than proactive. With security threats and threat environment, you've got to be proactive. You can't create, a contingency plan or a capability after an event occurs, right? You've got to do it before that, so that you at least have something. It's constant position improvement, man. As you were in the military as well, Marine, infantry, it's always filling a sandbag with dirt and putting one more up. You want to make sure that you always have the tactical advantage. If you go into a fight without it, you did not have a very good plan from the get-go, right?
Yep.
So like I said, I think we're going to learn a lot from this. And target hardening in general, and that whole process, it's become a part of, I don't want to say the fabric of American life, but it's more prevalent. We have availability of information. We can see the problems that are occurring in real time. Everybody has a phone and a watch, and so you see these things. It makes it seem like it's much more, it's happening.
You're inundated with it.
And the stats, some things are escalated, some things aren't. Some things we're doing good, some things we're doing bad. But criminals have been around since the dawn of mankind, right? And humankind, I should say. And the reality is there's always going to be a threat to mitigate. There's always going to be an environment that we have to have first responders, security, law enforcement, warriors, military. There's always going to be a need for that. Having them well trained and capable, giving them the tools and the resources, using threat vulnerability assessments to assess the environments that are going to be operating in, all lead to positive outcomes and not negative ones.
Yeah, and in short, it kind of, it seems like, the security assessment is probably the most important step, because if you're not doing that, you're relying on luck and hope that if an event does occur, you just happen to be in the right place at the right time, happen to have the right response to whatever incident occurs. So, definitely, whether it's your home residence all the way to, again, defending a nuclear plant or a military facility, you have to do it. You have to put in the prep work on the front end.
Right. 90% of any operation, and this is just me and my opinion alone, but 90% of it is the planning piece, man. Execution's 10%. If you've got everything where you need it, when you need it, how you need it, and you've done the appropriate preparation of the battlefield, you've done the intelligence or the collection of information that's required, it makes it a lot easier to respond, within the contingency planning that you did in the planning process, to be able to deal and mitigate with that threat or whatever that unexpected issue was, and be able to respond to it quickly, that friction point, and then create a solution, and then continue on the mission set, without that. And I know we're using a lot of acronyms and speaking in a lot of these tactical terms. These same things apply to a school setting, and military setting, law enforcement setting.
House.
You've got a plan so that you can execute efficiently. And that's what's going to be the difference between maybe a really negative set of consequences or a positive set of consequences.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it. But yeah, it was a good chat. Again, if you guys have any questions, or even looking to learn more about what a security assessment is and what the outcomes are, what that process looks like, hit us up at our website. You can shoot us an email as well at info@kontekindustries.com. We have, quite a few of us on staff that are more than willing and capable of helping you guys out. So just give us a shout. But Pete, appreciate the time.
Cheers.
We'll see you next month.
Absolutely.
All right.